His abilities may be of Jor-El's blood, but it was his time in Smallville with Jonathan and Martha Kent and all the people there that made Clark Kent a hero. Now, in a Digging for Kryptonite event years in the making, we revisit the seminal, decade-long television series Smallville, starring Tom Welling, and how its reinterpretation of a legend cemented my fandom and brought the Man of Steel into a new era. The final act of a Superboy fan journey is at hand. These are the Trials of Smallville. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superboy fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. These are the Trials of Smallville, and joining me to discuss the romantic relationships of the series is the editor-in-chief of Krypton Site and K-Site TV, returning guest Craig Byrne. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back. I'm very excited to be talking about this with you.
You were here way back for episode 9 of this podcast in early 2021, and we talked about your Superman fan journey, your experience with Smallville, the secret origin of Krypton Site, and how formative it was for myself and so many other Smallville fans watching the show over the years. So I would definitely say if anyone hasn't listened to that original interview that you and I did, please go back and check it out, because it was a lot of fun, and it was weird and surreal to finally connect with you after all of those years of visiting the site.
Well, it's also so interesting to me because now that, through social media, I feel like so many people who run Superman-related sites or podcasts, we all end up becoming friends and interacting with each other. Like, I'll chat with you today, and then I might have gotten a message from Zach from Always Hold On to Smallville this morning, and then I'll tweet at Michael Bailey. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it really is a wonderful thing. I'm excited to have you here. I'm really curious to get your perspective on the ships of the show, especially given your role moderating the Krypton Site forum during that time when the show was airing. Before that, let me lob you just a meatball of a question you can make a meal out of here.
Oh boy.
The romance of Smallville, the relationship drama, the angst, how critical was that to your personal enjoyment of the show and the overall success and longevity of the series?
I think I'm going to answer your second question first because, obviously on Krypton Site for years, the shippers would always be fighting with each other, yapping at each other. It wasn't quite as bad as shipping has become in the present day. Because, I feel like now people have gotten really, really mean. But, there was just so much investment by the audience, whether they wanted Clark with Lana or Chloe or Lois, anything like that. And so that did fuel a lot of discussion, a lot of arguments, but it kept people invested in the show. And the really funny thing to me is that, there are people who'd be like, well, I don't want to watch a Chloe episode, or I don't want to watch a Lois episode. But those people were the first ones to tune in and hate on it. So it kept the show going for 10 years. It kept it fresh. Did they drop the ball sometimes? Of course. But, I think it's kind of genius that they kept it going like they did. It's unfortunate, obviously, that it took a while to get to Clark and Lois because of, movie limitations and that sort of thing. But we got it, and that kind of contributes to the notion that Smallville reinvented itself multiple times over 10 seasons. And I think that's also very cool. As for my own enjoyment, I know at the time it probably caused more stress than it needed to, because fortunately we had a whole team of moderators at the site, so it wasn't just me. But sometimes it was like being a kindergarten teacher. You got the kids going at each other, and there still were times where people kind of stayed in their lane. I feel like the Chloe fans are mostly at Television Without Pity. There was a site called Sweet for the Klanas, and then Divine Intervention for the Chlois people, and that's fine, good. But Krypton Site is where several groups kind of came together and would kind of fight against each other. But so that was a little stressful sometimes. And also when people would accuse of like a bias. Like, oh yeah, Craig is a Chloe shipper. He doesn't, or whatever. And I wasn't a Clark and Chloe shipper. They just assumed. Or, I mean, I think I've said several times my like my preferred ending for Smallville would have been Clark with his cape, and I didn't get what I wanted. But yeah, so it was hit or miss, but it did keep the show alive.
Absolutely. To answer my own questions as well, I feel like the role of the romance on the show and how it contributed to the success and longevity really can't be overstated. I feel like it was such a critical component. I think it was an essential ingredient for a WB drama of that era. But more importantly, I think it went such a long way towards the show having the broad appeal that it did. And over the past couple of episodes, we talked a lot about Clark's journey overall. And one of the places where we started was just this idea that the show was able to take this legend, this mythology, these larger than life characters and situations, and ground everything in the humanity, in the emotion. Yes, we were still dealing with a heightened situation, but still the show was mining Clark's home life with his parents, his high school life in the early seasons, his friendships, and probably most of all, the romance. And even for myself, someone who had the background in the comics and watching Lois and Clark and the Superman movies, yes, I loved when we got into the heavier mythology aspects of the show. But honestly, I was just as invested in all of the love drama and all of the Clark Lana back and forth. Was there a point where maybe it went on too long? Maybe I wish it had taken a different turn? Sure. But for the record, and I want to say at the outset, I was so invested in this. It was such a key component, certainly of my enjoyment of the show as well.
I think it's interesting to look back on now, like rewatching the show, because I mean, partly due to the things that happen in Allison Mack's life, not in Smallville, I think Chloe has kind of been removed from the equation a little bit in some fans' minds. So it really makes it clear that Lana is Clark's past, Lois is his future. And if you watch with that perspective, I mean, Clark was like head over heels for Lana. She probably shouldn't have ever entertained him just because every time she hung out with him, she almost got killed. But, she was the girl next door, for a while, the unattainable gem, with kryptonite in her necklace. But I think, I mean, this is kind of jumping ahead, but I think one of the things Smallville might not have done well is I feel like the comics firmly placed Lana in his past, whereas Smallville just went the easy route by filling her with kryptonite. And I think that was a little unfortunate. But like, I totally understand why the show operated in the way that it did. And yeah, so it's very interesting to watch in retrospect. And, at least in the first season, you can tell why Clark is so into Lana, because she like helps people. She cares about people. I do think it got really grating when she went on about secrets and lies after a while. And it was also kind of annoying, the notion that Aquaman can know Clark for 5 minutes and know a secret, but the girl he loves can't know. I thought that was kind of silly. So I was glad when she finally found out also, obviously. And, just talking with Kristen before off the record, she seemed to have a good grasp on Lana and what worked and what didn't. So I can't blame her for anything that's written on the page. But yeah, it just was what it was. And, it was kind of, I mentioned, the fan forum that was called Sweet. It was sweet. Like the two of them under the oak tree. Sweet.
Yeah, there was a chemistry there that was undeniable. And the sense of longing initially from Clark towards Lana, and then quickly that is reciprocated. That longing was something the show was really able to capture and show over and over. And yeah, I mean, I think there was something truly captivating and endearing about the two of them, especially in those early seasons. There are a number of moments I kind of want to highlight. A lot of them have music cues that are so ingrained
Oh,
in my mind.
yes.
But to your point about The Secret, we'll talk more about this, but that was one of the things I was really reflecting on, which is any show, right? You need tension. There needs to be dramatic tension, but it can come from different places and arrive in different forms. And I think when you look at the first couple of seasons and the Clark-Lana side of it all, in the first season, the main obstacle is that she has a boyfriend. She's with Whitney. Maybe one of the most relatable, universal kind of obstacles, right? High school life, college life, beyond. We all encounter situations like that. In fact, I talked about one of those in one of our earlier episodes. But,
nice.
But I think, again, in that first season, there's Whitney as our obstacle. In the second season, she does break up with Whitney via video message early on. And then, of course, we find out later that he passed away. But there's still, I think, a little bit of the Whitney shadow, and then just the fear of taking that next step. And maybe most notably, we have a couple of instances where Clark is on Red Kryptonite, and it really derails the progress that he was making with Lana. So I feel like over those first couple of seasons in particular, yes, Clark's inability to be fully honest with her, especially after the tornado, it looms over the proceedings, but I don't feel like it's the sole source of tension or roadblock for them. But I feel like as we get deeper into it, that really becomes the predominant roadblock in their way.
Well, here's some trivia you might not have known. Originally, Whitney was going to die in the season 1 finale. And it was going to be a thing where Clark was only able to save one of them. And that was going to be the source of the tension in season 2.
Interesting.
Which would have been a very different direction. I don't know if that's ever been said in public or anything, but when I heard that Whitney was coming back and, spoiler warning, dying, we kind of knew it was going to come. So, but yeah, I think that would have been a stronger thing, although maybe the implication that Clark couldn't save someone wasn't that good, but we got that in Reckoning anyway. So
yeah, it's the sort of thing, even from the outset, when he learns about his extraterrestrial origins, just the fact that he arrived in this ship with the meteor shower that rained down all this death and destruction, including claiming the lives of Lana's parents, to think there was enough guilt that he was already dealing with. And as the series would progress, we would have more and more instances of him blaming himself. So I am actually kind of glad that they didn't go that route with Whitney, but that is a scoop. I'd never heard that. So thank you for sharing that. But I guess going back to this idea of tension, because I was really thinking about this, especially as we get deeper into the series and they've actually finally embarked on a relationship together at the start of season 5. Of course, when he's powerless, he's mortal and there's nothing between them and they consummate their relationship. And of course, it's short-lived when his powers return and he has to go back to hiding. And the show also took this approach that Clark wasn't able to, or at least felt he wasn't able to, engage in physical relations while he had his powers. And of course, that would shift in season 9. He underwent some training with Jor-El in the Fortress and was able to figure that out with Lois.
Oh my.
But I was thinking about this. It's like, for me, and we could spend a whole episode talking about what we wish they had or hadn't done, but
yes, true.
I mostly want to focus on what they did do, but just kind of as an example, I feel like when they were at that point in their relationship, the tension could have been that they're unable to be physically intimate with each other, even if she knew why, right? Like if she knew the secret and she knew why, of course she's Lana, she would be understanding, but still, that's a part of their relationship that they had and that then they weren't able to access. You would and could still have tension there. I don't know that you always needed to also layer the secret on top of that.
But there is the notion that he arrived with the meteor shower that smushed your parents.
Yes.
So there's kind of some guilt there as well. And that might have held him back from telling her.
Sure. No, absolutely. And the whole notion of Clark sharing his secret, I do want to circle back to that. But you brought up the end of their relationship. And yeah, not to jump ahead, but it's an essential piece of everything that we're talking about here. And I had a little bit of an epiphany about Clark and Lana over the course of my rewatch that I want to share. But before I do, because you'll have to bear with me for a minute when I get into this. I compare it to How I Met Your Mother. It's a whole thing. But I know you did some rewatching as well. I didn't force you to do a ton of homework just so the audience knows. But I know you did rewatch a bunch and I appreciate that. And I am just kind of curious, just big picture, any revelations might be too strong a word, but anything that jumped out at you where maybe your view of one thing had been something and now it kind of shifted, or anything that kind of changed through this rewatch?
I think the only thing that's changed actually is, unfortunately, Chloe. I feel like I have less tolerance for the character now that those real life things had happened. And I sometimes, like I've noticed Chloe being jealous way too many times. It's like Clark has said he's not into you like that, and she keeps going. I also think it was a missed opportunity. Into season 2, they kind of hinted that Chloe was going to team up with Lionel, and it really didn't go anywhere. And like Chloe being kind of bad would be kind of awesome. I do think Chloe as the best friend and confidant worked, like when she knew the secret. And I think that's part of why season 5 was so well received, because Clark and Lana were together. Lana was the girlfriend, but Chloe was the one who like he counted on, who knew his secret. And not to mention the fact that you kind of jumped on earlier, which is Clark and Lana did not have that drama anymore. They could just be themselves. And I mean, I still don't know how he explained to Lana how he survived at the end of episode 503, but you can't win them all. But and it did inspire her kind of looking into, like, she knew something was up. I think that's kind of cool.
Right. Yeah, that's the famous episode where he is resurrected by Jor-El, who's inhabiting the body of Lionel, and stops a nuclear missile that's en route to destroy Smallville. And it's a magnificent reunion scene between the two of them. She thinks Clark's dead, and then she goes to the house and he's there. And the fact that he is alive, I can actually suspend my disbelief. It's like, okay, it's a miracle. But he was in an explosion, like his clothes are torn. He's covered in all this dirt. And it's like that. How do you explain that?
Well, I do love that even in Aqua, he kept a bandage on.
Yeah.
To give the illusion that he had been shot.
Yeah.
Which sometimes Smallville wasn't always the best with the continuity like that. But that was a good thing. I also think if we're talking about the early seasons, we do need to mention Alicia.
Yes, let's. I do want to talk about Alicia.
We'll get there.
Let me.
Okay.
I've been.
Sorry.
No. It's all good. But I've been chomping at the bit to share this because for years, Craig, since I watched the show, and even as recently as last week, when Zach and I talked about Requiem, Lana's final episode in season 8.
I'm so sorry.
When she has donned this biosuit that Lex had created, it gives her powers. It also allows her to absorb kryptonite radiation. And Lex arranges the situation that forces her to absorb this bomb's worth of kryptonite. And it bombards her with so much radiation, she literally, physically cannot be in physical proximity to Clark. And so they have this tearful kiss and farewell in the loft where they've had so many of their scenes before, and they're professing their love to each other. And Clark, desperation is the word that comes to mind. He's pleading with her to stay, even if they can't be together. He doesn't want to lose her. And we end that scene, that episode, this entire relationship with Clark on the floor of the loft saying, "I love you," as he's in pain from the kryptonite. And as recently as last week, it always bothered me that that's how they ended that relationship, because in my mind, and yes, this is informed by Superman and other media, especially the comics, and especially the post-crisis comics that I grew up reading, where they were not these star-crossed lovers, where she was the girl he left behind, right? In Byrne's Man of Steel, there's this whole idea. He shows her that he can fly, takes her flight, reveals his secret before he leaves Smallville. She thinks he's going to propose marriage, but that's not what he has in mind. He doesn't have that level of feelings for her. So the whole time I'm watching Smallville, including through Requiem, I'm assuming we'll eventually get to that point where Clark realizes she's not the one for him, and he makes the choice to move past this relationship, and the two of them can achieve some sort of platonic, friendly dynamic, not unlike what we see in Superman and Lois, for example.
Yes.
That's where I always thought we were going, and I was frustrated that we didn't get there.
Well, it's kind of funny you mentioned that because before Kristen came back for season, those 5 episodes in season 8, she actually called me through a mutual friend and asked if I had any suggestions that she could pass along on how they could bring back Lana without regurgitating Klana. And I said the thing I would do, they would never be down for, which is like Lana comes back and is just like, I'm done with your nonsense. Like I'll be your friend, but I'm not going to be that person. Because I also feel, so obviously that's not what ended up happening. But I feel like that arc is so kind of unfortunate because not only was Lana suddenly back in full force, but they kind of pushed Lois to the back. I think Erica missed most of that arc.
So Kristen was back for 5 episodes, and the only one that they were both in was the first one, Bride. And
that was just the final scene.
And it's right when Lois and Clark are going to have their first kiss during the dance. And then we hear Chloe's like, no way. And we cut to Lana, and Lois just kind of fades away, and that's it. And they never have any interaction. And so for a show that was built so much on the angst and the love triangles, like you would think they would have made a meal out of something like this, but they just didn't share the screen.
It would be like that Action Comics cover during the Byrne era where Lois and Lana are fighting. The white background.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, and that was the thing. It's like, the very next episode after Requiem, it seemed like we're back to the Clovis of it all, which I know is where fans wanted the show to go and where the show logically would go. But yeah, it was just very weird. Like, I really do agree they should have made the mutual decision. Just like, you know what? I'm going to go live my life. You have a big destiny to be super. Go for it.
Okay, so here's the epiphany that I had.
Okay, go for it.
Were you a fan of How I Met Your Mother?
I have seen the finale.
Okay. So
that's your question.
The finale aired over a decade ago. If anyone doesn't know what happens in the end and you really want to avoid spoilers, I guess skip ahead 60 or 90 seconds. So I loved How I Met Your Mother. I still love How I Met Your Mother, and I will always defend that finale. For anyone who needs a refresher or isn't familiar, the whole conceit of that show is that we have our protagonist, Ted, in the year 2030, telling the story to his children about how he met their mother. And the big twist at the end of the pilot is that the woman he's been talking about in that pilot is actually the Aunt Robin, right? Not the mother. So, not unlike Smallville, you're starting off with kind of like this doomed romance that we're called upon to invest in. And the Ted-Robin relationship is such a major fixture of the series. And we do eventually meet the mother, and she plays a small but important role in the final season. And then in the series finale, we have this reveal that as of Ted telling the story to his kids, the mother has been dead for 6 years. And the reason why Ted has been telling this story and why Robin looms so large in it is that these feelings have been rekindled, and he's interested in restarting things and wants to get a sense from the kids about how they feel. And they give their blessing, and we have this big final moment where he goes to her. People flipped the F out when this finale aired. And I'll be honest, I had some mixed feelings about it, but I came around because eventually I realized, I think, what the show was about in a very fundamental way and what it was trying to say. And I do genuinely think that a lot of people misinterpret the point of How I Met Your Mother, where I think a lot of fans felt like this was about him meeting the mother and all he ever really cared about was Robin, and that when he was with the mother, he only ever wanted to be with Robin. And I think that really misses the mark. I think what that show was saying is that for this guy who was going on and on for 9 seasons about finding the one, he actually had 2 great, true, profound loves in his life. And I genuinely think while he was with each one of them, he loved them completely and was not longing for anybody else. And when that kind of clicked into place for me, I made my peace with that finale. Similarly then, and that's kind of what I had in my head as I was rewatching a lot of these Clark and Lana episodes all the way through to Requiem, where that love story is the predominant romantic dynamic across the first 7 seasons and even a piece of season 8. And as much as other Superman media tells us that they land in a certain place, I think what I had to really recognize was what this particular interpretation was saying about their relationship, and whether this was their plan all along or just where it landed. But all we have are the episodes to look at. And I think when we look at them, I think it's almost akin to them killing her, right? Because no, she doesn't die at the end of Requiem, but they physically can't be together. It's not even just, oh, she moves away. It's no, they can't be together. It's like, yes, she continues to live her life. But the reason why they're not together is because they physically can't be. And that's obviously very different than them, one or both of them deciding not to be. But I think that the way this love story was presented to us, I think that's just what it is. This wasn't a matter of, okay, them moving to just kind of this platonic friendship, realizing they're not right for each other. It's like they ultimately weren't together because they couldn't be together. But, and this is, I think, really what I had to get over, it doesn't mean that he settles for Lois. It doesn't mean that he ends up with Lois only because he can't be with her. I think he gets to the point where he realizes Lois is the one for him. So I think those things can kind of occupy the same space. It can be this true, complete love that he had for Lana, right? But it can also be the case that he experiences that with Lois. Like you said before, one's the past and one's the future. But I was hung up on that for a long time, and I think I kind of cleared that hurdle after all these years.
Well, I think there is still, I mean, he still could have, completely loved her and vice versa. But I do think there was that history of, maybe Clark and Lana being together was a little bit toxic. I mean, well, it definitely was toxic when she's full of kryptonite. But, that's how I look at it now. Like, I feel like if there had been like a season 11, like filmed season 11, and Lana had come back, Clark wouldn't just regress to being into Lana. She could still exist in his heart as like a soulmate in a way, but Lois is his love. And also he's Superman. He doesn't, I don't know, maybe we're like glorifying Superman too much, but whatever. Also, I wanted to know, did Lex buy Aunt Robin earrings?
Oh, yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Colby Smulders, an early role there in Bound, right? Bound was from season 4.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, that was a little bit of a revelation that I had that kind of allowed me to make peace with the way that relationship wrapped up. I mean, I know, probably better than anybody, but I'm aware you have a whole contingent of fans out there who think Clark and Lana should have ended up together, right?
They still exist. I just saw one on Reddit today, like where I was like, I think I said something along the lines of what I said to you earlier about, in season 1, Lana was like helping people and she was so kind. And someone's like, she was kind after that too. I'm like, okay, but that's not her primary. I don't know if that makes any sense. It just wasn't her primary objective anymore. And yeah, I just I like how you put it. I think that's kind of cool. And I think we should accept that, he did love both of them at different times.
Yeah.
I think that's cool.
And we talked about this in our first couple of episodes. I don't think Smallville gets enough credit for its originality. And even in terms of how it set up Clark and Lana, again, there's no other interpretation of the legend that I'm aware of where the Clark and Lana romance is this prominent or is this developed or is this powerful. So they were doing something different with this. And, I do respect the track that they took.
Yeah, I was meaning to ask you, since you've done a bunch of shows about Superboy recently, what is the Clark and Lana relationship like there?
They touch on it very lightly. There's clearly a chemistry, a flirtation between Superboy and Lana, and they do share a few kisses, but it's never like they're in a relationship, right? They tread very lightly there. So yes, there's some element of romance, but nothing even close to the level of depth or development that we get here. So
okay,
again, I think that's such a key aspect to all of this. So we'll continue unpacking everything. One big picture question I have for you, because I think we've already spent obviously time with Clark and Lana. We'll continue to spend time with them, Clark and Lois. We'll circle back to Chloe. Of course, we'll talk Alicia. We'll have to talk about Lexana. But one question I have for you: are there any ships that never sailed that you wished had? Whether characters who were on the show or characters you wish had been on the show.
I don't know if it's an actual ship, but I remember the pilot hinted that there was a history between Jonathan and Aunt Nell.
Yes.
And I was always curious what that would look like and what that would be. And after seeing the actress that played Aunt Nell on a show called Millennium, I know what she is capable of as an actress, and I would have loved to have seen more of her. Like, I mean, she could have been a female Lionel if they had given her that material, which clearly they didn't want to. But so yeah, I was very curious to see that. Chloe and Pete might have been fun. I know John Glover has teased him and Lionel and Martha, but I was a little squicked by that idea.
Yeah, I know. There was that one moment in the kitchen where he starts to lean in, and I did. It just felt wrong. It just felt wrong.
Although it's hilarious when Lionel as Clark gives her a hug and his heat vision goes off.
Yeah,
in Transference. That's one of my favorite episodes of the whole show. But I'm trying to think other ships that I wish had happened. Oh, Lois and Tess.
Lois and Tess?
Yeah, because the two of them were flirting.
Fair,
like when
yes.
Lois comes dressed as a maid. I mean, I don't think they would actually. It's kind of like there are people who ship Clark and Lex together, but I didn't actually expect to see it. But it would have been amusing. I mean, by this point, Lois was definitely into Clark.
Yeah,
but yeah. So I'm going to throw Les. Wait, Les would be the name of their ship, I think. They never give us Green Arrow and Black Canary as a couple.
I know.
In any show. Give it to me now.
I know that one. That one's wild. That one's wild. Yeah, I Chloe and Pete. I think that would have been just. You know what? For Pete, this poor long-suffering guy. I feel so bad for Pete. Even in the episode Truth, where Chloe is infected and she compels everyone to tell the truth and asks Pete what the secret is, right? And of course, Clark's worried he's going to reveal Clark's secret, and instead Pete plants one on Chloe. He's like, "I've been in love with you." That's it. And then he leaves the show a few episodes later. Poor Pete. I think the main one for me relates to a character who never appeared, and I'm kind of like shocked that the show never brought her on. But Lori Lamaris, the mermaid. Not that I needed them to do full on mermaid, but the college era love of Clark. I mean, I would have been curious to see that character. That's probably the one where I'm like, I feel like that was a missed opportunity. And then also you mentioned Tess. I mean, Clark and Tess, some fire there too. Yes. That would have been interesting. I mean, I know we got the Clark Luthor bit, and that scene when Clark Luthor comes in to Tessa's office and they start making out, and she's surprised at first, but she goes right along with it.
I'm sure Rosenbaum was jealous if he ever sees it. When he gets to it in Talkville, he's going to be like, "So how was she?"
Yes, I'm sure he'll present that question. But yeah, I mean, I think those are kind of the main ones. It's one of those things we had so many ships over the years, so it's less a question of what didn't they do, and more. I think we have a lot to talk about as far as what they did do. I guess let me toss it to you. I mean, what are some of the moments or relationship milestones, especially in the Clark Lana realm, that stand out to you, that are so like seared into your brain that like when you think of Clark and Lana, you have these go-to moments? What stands out to you the most after all these years?
Well, again, there was when he lost his powers and they had no drama between each other. I thought that was wonderful. I just recently watched the last 2 episodes of season 2. So when they finally are kind of together, they're under the oak tree with the horses. I don't think we ever saw Clark riding a horse, but there was a horse for him there too.
Well, we saw Clark riding a horse later in Wrath. Clearly not Tom Welling, but we saw they were
okay.
Horse. That's where she gets his powers.
Remember that. And I know it's like very small, but in season 1, when I think Lex helps Clark do this, Clark shows the Warner Brothers cartoon.
Yeah.
Broadcasting onto the barn for Lana's birthday. I thought that was really sweet. So those are the primary, if I was to think about the two of them, moments.
Yeah, the drive-in theater that he sets up, and Enrique Iglesias' Hero is playing. I always remember that moment.
Yes.
The two of them screaming together on the football field at the end of Hothead, episode 3. The end of the pilot, I know it's in Clark's mind, but when he envisions this dance with Lana set to Everything by Lifehouse, and when I rewatched the pilot a few weeks ago, I mean, it was just like, it took me right back to being a kid watching that again. And that's introduced me to Lifehouse. I mean, Zach and I talked about this, like so many bands and songs like this show introduced me to. It was so formative in terms of my musical taste.
Well, it's really funny because I have Sirius XM in my car, and the station I usually listen to pretty much exclusively plays songs that were on Smallville, not intentionally. It just happens that way. And one day last week, they played Everything by Lifehouse. And the very next day, I heard Island in the Sun by Weezer, which was the first song from episode 2. So, they know what they're doing.
I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. So, those are some of the, I guess, especially some of those early moments that really stand out. To your point, the end of season 2, the beginning of the episode Calling, our 2-part season 2 finale, when she shows up in the barn with his birthday cake, right, and talks about how, he's like, well, this isn't really my birthday. It's just the date that they picked. And he's like, we just want to celebrate the day you came into our lives. And they share their first real kiss, right? Because they had kissed when she was under the influence of the Nicodemus. They had kissed when he was under the influence of Red Kryptonite. But this was like their first real, true, unaltered kiss. And it's one of these things where I think, not even speaking for other fans, just for myself, right? Their relationship went on for so long. And there were so many ebbs and flows to it, and things got very complicated and very messy. And I think it's sometimes easy to kind of forget just how pure and compelling a lot of those early moments were. And again, like that first kiss in the barn is one of those, right? That just stands out. It's such a beautiful moment and shows again this connection between the two of them.
And it also shows the parallels to, like real life situations just through a Superman filter, because, here he's finally gotten what he wants, but then he has to leave. And then you have, I mean, kind of jumping ahead, but you have the Red Kryptonite ring. And that's kind of like when somebody might start abusing drugs or alcohol to forget their sadness.
Yes.
And I think that's really interesting, a parallel. And I thought that was, and then, you think about like, season 3, she's moving away at the end of the season. And he thinks, I don't have a chance with her because she's going to be gone. And then she comes back, but she's dating the football coach.
I know. Which, speaking of that, I know much has been said, especially on Talkville, about how inappropriate it was that you had the football coach dating a high school senior. And they talk about it on the show itself. I'll be honest. They make a point about Lana being 18. He's only a year older. He's a freshman in college. She's a senior in high school. To me, the way bigger issue is the fact that you had Whitney, clearly a senior, dating a freshman in the first season. And there's all this talk about how long they've been together. So he's the year before he's 17 dating an 8th grader. I mean, I feel like people don't talk about that enough. Leave Jensen Ackles alone.
Well, yeah, so true. But I mean, we also don't discuss how creepy the friendship between Lex and Clark is.
There's that as well. I know. I think about
14 or 15.
I think about that a lot, and especially again, I was Clark's age watching the show. Now, as a grown man looking back on this, it's like, yeah, I mean, when I was 21, 22, I was like, I would be palling around with a 14-year-old. So
yeah, like when I was 21 or 22, I was hanging out with people who were a lot older than me because I worked at a newspaper and I was the youngest one there. Yeah, it's very interesting. So you were Clark's age when the show was on. I was Tom Welling's age when the show was on.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah. But, and we'll talk more about the Red Kryptonite, because that obviously factors in heavily to these relationships. But when you mention it's akin to someone using drugs, yes. And just kind of on this note with the relationships overall, I talked before about the show's ability to ground this mythology in these interpersonal dynamics, in the human, in the humanity and in the emotions. And that's the thing, throughout the show, really until the end when he finally connects with Lois and is able to share his secret and his life with her fully in a way he never has before. There is this sense of loneliness that is a big part of Clark's character. He has this secret that he has to keep, and that does limit the depth of relationship he's able to achieve, especially in the romance department. And while the specific secret that he has is not anything that, we could relate to per se, but just the idea of having a part of yourself that you feel you can't share or you don't know how you would be accepted.
Yes.
Or again, times when the person he's interested in is just with someone else. There are a number of scenes. I guess the one in particular that jumps out at me was the early season 6 episode Wither, where after he saved the day, you have Chloe and Jimmy off together. You have Ollie and Lois off together. You have Lex and Lana consummating their relationship. And you've got Clark bouncing his ball in the barn by himself. Right. And I have to say, just speaking from personal experience, I mean, I eventually found my Lois Lane, very happy. But during, I would say, the majority of watching Smallville, I did not have someone in my life like that. And so that kind of sense of longing and loneliness was something that resonated. I mean, I felt for Clark in that moment, bouncing that ball. And so, again, it was something deeply human, deeply personal and relatable that this show was able to capture. And it comes up over and over in these relationships. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of 2 of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. As we're charting kind of the evolution of the romance here and tackling some of these questions, so one of the other dynamics that is at least teased, if not fully explored, right, is this notion of Clark and Chloe. And from the jump, clearly she has these feelings for him. And as the first season progresses, it's an idea that eventually his eyes are opened to, and he seems to have some interest. We get to the point after the Adam Brody, crush episode where they're, I think that's where they're holding hands in the Talon. And then the next episode, he asks her to the dance. And then, of course, they have that big moment where they're about to kiss on the dance floor. And then there's this interruption about the tornado. I guess you already hit on this before, but as far as the Clark and Chloe of it all, I don't know if you've heard other episodes where I've talked about this, but my theory about Chloe is that while I think she brought an important value to the show in numerous respects, I think ultimately her character was detrimental in that I feel they had to siphon off attributes and dynamics from other characters in order to build Chloe. And so I don't know how healthy she was overall, but I think that, yes, there was something compelling about her individual character. But as far as a romance, historically and now upon rewatch, I guess I've always been in the same camp where I think early on there's something that does make sense about this. And there is a chemistry there, but it's never anything akin to Clark and Lana, Clark and Lois, or Clark and Alicia. There's a heat with all 3 of those romantic pairings that is just not there with Chloe. I mean, people might feel differently, but I do not see it.
Well, I think the thing with season 1, especially, but even later in the series, you saw this a couple times. I think Clark was a little possessive of Chloe. Like, hey, she's mine. And that's why he would like glomp onto her, but it was kind of unfair to her. I mean, Clark is not perfect. Even though he's Superman, he's not perfect. I'm sure we've all sometimes spent time with somebody that we weren't that into, but I don't know if that makes any sense. I do think he genuinely wanted to go to the dance with her, but I think the whole saving Lana aspect at the end of season 1 kind of solidified for him. Lana's the one that he wants, unfortunately. I think it would be very important for us to address the slowest people, the people that thought that Chloe was going to become Lois Lane.
Yes.
Because that was a driving force. And, I know a lot of those fans would be like, well, he doesn't end up with Lana and Chloe's going to get him because she's going to become Lois, which I think was fine in the first 3 seasons. I didn't like or understand why they threw those people a nugget when they had Chloe do an article as Lois Lane in season 3. But once Erica was on the show, I think that should have just flown out the door. But you had people still going on through through the end of the series, really. We're like, oh, there's an exit door above E.D. Lois's head. That's what they would call Erica's Lois. That means that she's going to die and Chloe's going to take her name. And it's like, why would she? It just never made sense. I know they kind of did the haha, just kidding with Jimmy. Like it was Henry James Olsen, his brother. But I don't think they would pull that twice. My also personal feeling, you said that, character aspects were taken from others. I felt that Chloe, she was, a strong journalist like Lois, but Lois knew how to temper herself. Like, Chloe would go too far. And Lois would know exactly how to get in and do her thing. And I think that would have been an interesting way to show how they're different without having one replace the other. It's like 2 totally different vibes and approaches.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about that a lot. No, your points are all well taken. I was thinking about just the different vibes, mostly in the context of I don't want to say Lana versus Lois. I'll just say Lana and Lois, where you see the appeal to Clark of both of them, I think, where with Lana, she's this almost ethereal beauty, right? She's sweet, she's kind,
yes.
She's the girl next door. There's clearly this bond, this warmth between them. Lois, meanwhile, gorgeous in her own way, right? There's a sexiness, a vivaciousness, a fire, a spark between the two of them. She gives him such a hard time, right? They're always bantering back and forth. It's such a different energy. And obviously it takes a while before they and the show were willing to go down the romance road with them. But, the dynamics are so different. Now, that's actually one thing I think the show did especially well, where they really carved out very distinct lanes, no pun intended, for each of those characters. And going back to what I was saying before about Clark loving both of them, completely for the time of each of those relationships, it's like, they each represent something, I think, distinct in his life and in his heart. With Chloe, though, and really, if any hardcore Chloe fans are listening, I know they're really not going to like this part, but rewatching a lot of those early episodes, she was so annoying with her feelings for Clark. And I think maybe part of this was a product of they did 22 episodes, right? And so I think there were certain moments and dynamics that, you saw repeated, right? They wanted to reinforce it. But again, just a lot of this all these comments to Clark about, there are other girls out there besides Lana. What really annoyed me, though, was at the start of season 2, after Clark had left her at the dance to go save Lana.
Right.
Chloe is the one, before Clark can say anything, Chloe is the one to pull the plug and say, let's just be friends. And Clark, because I just rewatched this, Clark clearly has a moment of like, oh, okay. And, she confesses to Peach. She's like, oh, defense mechanism. Like I said it first, but I don't know. We don't know exactly what Clark was going to say. So I feel like she shot herself in the foot with that, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
Similarly, she plants one on him at the end of season 5 when all the Zod business is going on, right, on Dark Thursday.
Right.
And at the start of season 6, she talks about it and she's like, oh, it's just the spur of the moment, life or death thing. Don't think anything of it. And he's like, oh, yeah, okay. But clearly it's like, I don't know, he might have been willing to entertain something. So I feel like she was her own worst enemy, that one.
I just also, I do think about the jealous looks. The season 2 when she walks in and Clark and Lana kissing. Also, they were way too concerned over what Chloe would think.
Yeah.
Of them getting together, I felt. But that, and then the famous moment from the end of, I think it was Facade with the dunk tank.
So much for
and
my
just
happy
the
ending.
Look, yeah. The look on Chloe's face when he sees that Clark is having fun with Lois. It's like she knew it was over. And so much for her happy ending.
There were a few moments where, even though I did find Chloe a bit grating, especially upon rewatch, I think more so than I did back in the day. But there were a few moments where I feel like the show really did kind of use her as a punching bag, and I did feel for her. The end of Facade that you mentioned is definitely one with the dunk tank and the Avril Lavigne song. But even before that, in season 2, the episode Dichotic with Jonathan Taylor Thomas, where he's obviously able to split himself into 2, and he's pursuing romances with both Chloe and Lana, and telling each of them not to say anything. And at one point, Chloe's talking to Clark, and she's like, yeah, Ian told me that he's really more interested in me, but not to tell Lana. And Clark says to her, he's like, and you really believe that? And she's like, what? Is it so hard to believe? And again, I don't think he meant it as harshly as it came across, but you feel for her. And then similarly in the episode Fever, when Clark is sick and
when she writes the
her
letter.
big moment with the letter, I'm the girl of your dreams, masquerading as your best friend. My dad says there are 2 kinds of girls in the world, the girls you grow out of and the girls you grow into. I hope I'm the latter. She's going on. And this guy in his delirium, all he can muster is, Lana? I mean, so again, there are moments where my heart goes out to Chloe, and I do feel for her.
That kept the audience watching, though, and interested.
But I do have to say, the end of Dichotic is one of my all-time favorite Clark moments, where he says to the 2 of them, you've been treating me like a jealous boyfriend, and none of us have actually dated. And they're like, well, what do you want? He's like, I just want to go back to being friends. He's like, are you sure that's what you really want? Yeah. And he walks out of the town, and he's got this just self-satisfied, smug look on his face. At least that's how I read it. And I just love that moment for him. I can't really explain why, but he was just so pleased with how he stood up for himself. I loved it.
One of my favorite moments of the show that was unfortunately cut, but it's on the DVD, was the end of Gone. Well, once they find Chloe, and it's a scene of Lois, Chloe, and Lana and Clark. And it's like these 3 women are just surrounding him. And it's like, Clark, what did you get yourself into?
Yeah. Oh, I know I watched that at the time. I don't remember that offhand, but I know sometimes you find these treasures on the deleted scenes. But returning to that earlier question about those, so all that to say, with Chloe, I don't know. Historically, I think I've always felt like, hey, they should have explored a romance between them at some point, since the show ran so long. I don't know. In retrospect, I kind of feel like I'm glad that they didn't. I don't know that it was ever really there. Certainly from Chloe's point of view, it was, but I don't know that it ever fully was from Clark's. And the fact that I think ultimately the right lane for the character was as that confidant and ally, even though as we get into that part of the show, she really usurps the role of the Kents that the Kents had played as the confidants and the advisors. But it was part of the evolution of the show. And I don't know, the fact that they ended up remaining just these great friends. I think there's something special about that, as opposed to, they're great friends and they dated for a season. So, that's not a ship that I'm like, I wish that had sailed. I'm good with where we with where we landed with Chloe, I guess.
Fair.
But other Klana moments, there's one, and I've talked about it in other episodes, but the end of Phoenix with Dido's White Flag playing, to me, I think is the quintessential perfect Klana scene. If you said to me, you have to pick one scene that encapsulates their entire dynamic, it's that scene. I think that's as close to like a perfect scene between the two of them as there is on the show.
Remember it.
You don't remember it? Clearly it wasn't as memorable, but I don't know. It always made such a
was
big...
that in the Talon?
No, it was out in the field. This is after Clark had his whole running around time in Metropolis, right? At the end of season 2,
right?
He is getting these messages from Jor-El, so he destroys the ship, and it causes this accident that Jonathan and Martha are in. She loses the baby. Clark is distraught, and he decides to put on the red kryptonite ring and leave, and he has this wild time in Metropolis over the summer. He's ripping off banks. He's buying these fancy cars. He's a bouncer at a club. He's bringing all these girls, but he never goes home with them. He's got this apartment. And again, eventually, we talked about this a couple episodes ago, but Jonathan gets the powers from Jor-El and is able to bring him home. Anyway, but we get to the end of Phoenix, the end of the 2-part season 3 premiere, and Lana shows up on horseback to the farm. Clark is putting the sign back up because the Kents were going to lose the farm before Lex intervened. And she talks about how she really wants to know him. And he's like, the way you looked at me in Metropolis, it's like you were disgusted. She's like, well, you can't blame me. I was confused. And he's like, all last year, I tried to be the right guy for you. He's like, but I'm not. He's like, this will never work. And as she gets on the horse and rides away, she's like, Clark, you never had to try. And I just feel like it hit on all of the most essential beats of the dynamic between them. And the White Flag song by Dido is playing and the sun is setting. And it's just the setting, the lighting, the music. I just loved it, man.
I think I need to watch that episode again. And Exile, since I just watched the last 2 of season 2.
Yeah. It's funny, too, because, again, the Clark and Lana, it looms large throughout, but especially in those first couple of seasons, I feel like season 3, it's a little bit on the back burner, especially when we get into all that business with Adam Knight, the Ian Somerhalder arc, and obviously it's a big Lex-heavy season. And then season 4, we've got Lana possessed by the witch and the quest for the stones. But in the midst of all of that, they do share the dance together at the prom, which is a nice moment. Again, Lifehouse, you and me. We always have to have Lifehouse for those clutch moments.
Something that you might not remember is that they had a Comic-Con panel that year before season 4. And Miles Miller said at the panel that Klana is dead. Now, a showrunner would never get away with saying something like that now because the shippers would have them killed. But really, there was no Klana until I think it was episode 17 or 18 of the season. Yeah. And, it was after the realization that, maybe Jason wasn't that great.
Yeah. They had to pivot very quickly with his character, and you really saw a very abrupt shift. But yeah, I know it really is on the back burner. And then, of course, she gives him the crystal that she had in the finale, and she says she loves him. And then, like we said, they finally embark on this relationship at the start of season 5. This is another big picture question I have for you. Is it not crazy to think it took until the start of season 5 before they were actually in a relationship for an extended period of time?
I don't think so, because, we did kind of get them in a relationship at the end of season 2. We had these little teases. I think that's actually one of the things that's kind of brilliant about Smallville. And I talk about this a little bit when I recorded Talkville the other week, that the larger Arrowverse shows right now, or the ones that we had until about 2 years ago, they blew all their good stories in the first 2 or 3 seasons. Whereas Smallville, like I said, it managed to keep itself going, and it gave the fans a little bit of what they wanted and then a little bit more. And so I think it was completely appropriate how it turned out. Maybe the occasional Klana stuff in season 6 and 7 was a little much, but it is what it is.
Fair enough. You know what, to your point, I've made that argument about the show and Clark's journey, about how there are always people, why isn't he flying? Why isn't he in the costume? It's like, well, no, that's not what the show is, right? And that you need to have somewhere for the character to go. And I've made that same argument about the Arrowverse, about how, it's cool for the first season or 2 of The Flash or Arrow when they're full-fledged superheroes in costume doing their thing. And then you get to season 3 and 4 and beyond, and it's like, oh, like they don't really have a ton of places to go in terms of the further development of the character. So to your point, I think in fairness, yeah, I guess we can apply that same logic to the romance. I guess there's a part of me, and maybe this is just the comic book fan or just as a fan of Smallville, where I do wish, yes, they had their moments, right? They had their start of a relationship at the end of season 2. They have their dance at the prom, which is a major milestone. But I guess if I had my magic do-over of Smallville, I would have had them in a relationship for their senior year. I think having them actually date for a proper amount of time while they were still in high school, there could have been something to that. Again, like, it's just kind of crazy to me. Like, they don't actually start dating until past high school. She doesn't know the full secret until the end of season 6. It's not until season 7 when they actually have an extended relationship without his secret being between them. But then she starts keeping secrets. So we're still in that same realm. It's just flipped. It's wild to me. But again, it was a different era of television too, where a lot of things were on the slow burn.
Well, it was a different era, but also, like, I'm sure there are some things they would have done different if they knew they had only 10 seasons, or they knew we have Michael and Kristen for only 7 seasons. I mean, some of the stuff's probably at the seat of their pants. Like, I don't think when they started the show that they realized they're having Lois Lane in season 4. But, furthering that, I'm pretty sure when they started season 4, they thought 5 would be the end.
Your point is well taken. That was something Zach and I talked about. You have a few seasons in a row there where you look at key moments, and especially the beginnings of certain seasons where it's like, oh, they're teeing up an end game here, or at least creating an opening for it. And then they kept going. We've talked about this idea of obviously the secret that Clark keeps to protect the people close to him, and or because he's scared. That's an idea that's brought up numerous times throughout the show. Like, are you not telling them because you're scared, or because you're trying to protect them? Whether it's either or both, but this looms large throughout the series, obviously, and especially in the romance department. One big picture question I had for you, which is, do you think it would have been interesting if the show had Clark reveal, for example, to Lana, that he has powers, but not that he's an alien? One of the reasons I bring this up is we just did an episode on Superman's Secret Origin by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank. And one of the things that I was reminded of in rereading that is that's essentially the approach that Secret Origin takes, where Lana knows about his abilities. But after he learns that he comes from Krypton, she talks to him like, oh, I'll help you find out why you can do all of these things. And he kind of pushes her away. So eventually she'll learn that, even in the comic book lore. But in that particular story, it's this idea of, okay, she knows he has powers, but she doesn't know why. And that's essentially what the show does with Alicia. But it's just funny. And I know there's an episode early on in season 3, Extinction, right, where there is a conversation at the end where Lana talks to Clark and essentially theorizes that he is a meteor freak. And he says to her, he's like, Lana, like, I know that would be an easy answer, but I wasn't infected by the meteor rock. Which is true. I go back and forth on this because part of me feels like, hey, that could have been an interesting way of easing up a little bit on all the secrets and lies, but still having a larger truth that he's keeping.
Yeah.
There might have been something to that at some point in the show. There might have been something to that.
I agree. And they would have had less to hide.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the secret, this was one of the things that I was thinking about because I was in rewatching episodes and kind of charting the Klana of it all. I'm like, what were the points at which he was ready to tell her? And why was he ready to tell her at that point? And then why did he ultimately not, or why did he undo it? And I kind of zeroed in on 3 distinct moments. The first is at the end of season 3 when Lana's going to leave for Paris, right? There's that episode Legacy, the second Christopher Reeve episode, and Clark and Lana, again, I think for the most part kind of been on the back burner, but they share this kiss and he doesn't want to have any regrets, but she pumps the brakes, and then she decides she doesn't want to miss out on opportunities in life, and she decides she's going to go to Paris. And Clark realizes like he can't keep doing this to her, right? So he decides he's going to tell her the secret. But then this is when Pete is abducted by the FBI agent who roughs him up trying to get information about Clark. And this is when Pete leaves, and when Pete confesses like, hey, like this is a heavy burden keeping your secret. Like I'm always worried that I'm going to mess up, and he leaves town. And that's why Clark decides not to tell her. And then, in season 5, right? They start off on this great note, no secrets because he doesn't have his powers.
Right.
And then he has to start lying again. And he's driving her away. He's losing her. And so in Reckoning, the 100th episode with James Blunt, You're Beautiful playing, he takes her to the fortress and reveals everything and proposes. And of course, she ends up dying. And so he gets a do-over crystal from Jor-El, and the events unfold differently. And that's when we lose Jonathan. And then season 6, when she's about to marry Lex, in the episode Promise, he shows up and he's like, we need to be together. He's like, if it's about my secret, I'll tell you. I'm not like other people. And she cuts him off because, she's been spying on him. She's figured out that he has powers.
Yeah.
And then finally, it's at the end of season 6 when he confesses fully. But my takeaway from all of this, and thank you for your patience as I was rattling all of that off, but my takeaway from this is that I think in contrast to what we'll see with Lois, and I think this is a really important point, I think Clark's attempts to tell Lana, or instances where he does tell Lana, are driven more by desperation. He doesn't want her to leave for Paris. He doesn't want to lose her in Reckoning. He doesn't want her to marry Lex. Those are the key moments where he is bringing himself to tell her, versus when he does ultimately tell Lois, they're in a good, healthy place, but he recognizes for them to move forward, he needs to share this part of himself. And so I think by the time you get to that point, you see this confidence and this maturity. And it's not that I don't want to paint it as Lana makes him desperate. But that dynamic you mentioned before, not always the healthiest. I think that's an instance of it. I think there is a level of desperation that the Lana Clark dynamic brings out in him. And so that was one thing that really stood out to me.
I think one thing that's really interesting about The Secret with Lois is I do believe there's a part of Clark that was very amused by her obsession with the blur, because their dynamic was always ribbing each other and teasing each other. And it's like, Lois thinks she knows everything. Haha, she doesn't. And so, it was more playful. So, but yeah, and I thought it was great that Lois figured it out before he told her.
Yes.
But when he told her, finally, they were at like a very comfortable place where they were both ready. So it wasn't Hail Mary to try to stop something bad from happening. It was like, okay, we're in a good place. Let's keep this going. And, it's very interesting. And I know we're going to get to the Clark and Lois of it all, but just the evolution of those characters is, people who tease each other and then eventually, kind of like each other, and they're crushing on each other. And then we see, and I think maybe part of the reason they worked as a couple is because they weren't as dramatic.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think throughout Lois's tenure on the show, you see this lightness that she's able to bring out in Clark that you don't get in many other places. And I think it's very noticeable and purposeful, and points to why they ultimately end up together. Although I do want to say one thing in fairness to and defense of Lana. There's a moment at the beginning of Hidden at the start of season 5. This is before Clark gets his powers back, but Clark and Lana wake up in bed together at the Kent house, and they realize that they fell asleep together. The plan was to do what they needed to do, and then she would go back to the Talon, right? But they ended up falling asleep. And it's this very comical moment between the two of them as they're trying to put their clothes on and sneak out. And Lana's ribbing him. She's mocking him. She's like, oh yeah, we won't fall asleep. But what else are we going to do at 2:00 in the morning? And it's that kind of side of Lana and Clark and Lana I wish we had been able to see more of, because again, you see more of that lightness when we get to Lois and Clark, but I feel like there was an opportunity for that with Clark and Lana as well. And that's a scene that always jumped out at me. I love that dynamic between them. It wasn't as, so much of Clark and Lana, it was so heavy and it was so fraught. And again, all of this longing, and it was nice to see that kind of ease between them.
And I think Clark needed that, because sometimes he could be a stick in the mud. And the most fun times, even before Lois was on the show, is when he allowed himself to have fun. Like, one of my favorite moments in the pilot, which is cut from most airings, is when he piles up the trucks of Whitney and the other jocks. It's like Clark can be a little naughty sometimes, not even need red kryptonite for it. You know, that's why, like I said, the thing about how I think Clark was kind of amused by Lois's reaction sometimes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess looking at the broad strokes of the Clark-Lana relationship, and maybe we've already answered this in terms of kind of respecting the slow burn of everything, but even putting aside when they actually started embarking on a relationship, but just the secret. I mean, do you think there was an opportunity for that to happen earlier? Would the show have benefited from that? Or would that have let the air out of the balloon, so to speak, in terms of this tension? Like, was it the right call to prolong it as long as they did?
Back then, I probably would have thought it would have been better for her to know better or know earlier. But kind of based on our conversation tonight, just thinking about how the show was paced, kept people involved and excited about it, I think it kind of worked out.
I agree. However, the one thing that I will say, and this is again another thing kind of realizing as I'm rewatching, I think the continued secret, it becomes a problem for me after Reckoning. And the reason why I say that is that in Reckoning, you see her reaction, right? She shows up at the barn. He's promised her this epic day. He takes her to the caves. He places the key in. They're transported. We actually see the transport with the lights, to the fortress. She's stunned by this scenario she finds herself in, picks her up, this giant leap to the other area in the fortress. And he reveals that he's from Krypton. He crushes the coal. He fuses it with the heat vision into the ring. He proposes. And he gives her time to think about it. And when she comes back later, she accepts his proposal. And it's just a small part of the first half of that episode, but she knows the secret. She's in on it. And it just is a whole fresh new dynamic. I mean, I think one of the things throughout the series that we see, or I felt at least watching the show, is that every time a character learned the secret, Pete, Chloe, Lana, Lois, yes, you lose that tension, but it opens up other dynamics and things to play. And so showing us how she would accept him and what it would be like between them. And there still was, here's the other thing, I guess, when I talk about tension, it's like, yes, there are other ways to create tension between them, but then also another avenue to pursue is tension directed at the both of them between those on the outside, like Lex, right? And you see that in Reckoning. And of course he goes after her and that leads to the car accident. But again, I just feel like there were other things that they could kind of play, and Reckoning showed that. And so to take that huge step back, like to put that genie back in the bottle. And it's one thing if after Reckoning, like she left the show or she had a completely different storyline, but they kept us in that Clark and Lana vein. And I don't know. I think it just, for me, it became harder because we saw what we could have.
Well, also, Clark saw what he could have.
Yeah.
Clark knows what her reaction would be now.
Yeah. I know she accepts him in Reckoning. She accepts his proposal. And then at the end of season 6, because again, earlier in the season in Promise, she set up this whole scenario where Chloe's trapped in the wine cellar and Clark has to swoop in and save her. And so she sees him use the power. She knows he has powers, but it's not till the season 6 finale, Phantom, where again, classic loft scene between them. And he reveals himself in full, right? He uses his super speed to stop her from leaving. And she's like, I know you have powers. And he's like, there's more. And he goes on about being from Krypton. And she kisses him and she says, you're still the same Clark Kent to me. So common denominator, right? In both of those instances where he tells her. Now, we're at the point kind of as we're going through all of this where I think we're heading into Lexana territory. I just want to circle back because we've mentioned her, but we haven't really talked about Alicia, because in the first major era of the show, right? I mean, obviously Clark and Lana loom so large. We have kind of this maybe sort of thing with Chloe, but then there's Alicia Baker, a meteor infected student who Clark has this romance with in the season 3 episode Obsession, where they're on a class field trip right at the Luthor Corp facility, and they're in an elevator and it starts to crash, and he uses his powers to stop it, and he turns to her, he's like, please don't tell anyone about this, and she teleports him away and reveals she has this power, and then of course, true to the episode's title, she proves to be obsessive towards all of this and eventually has to be stopped. But then she comes back for this 2-parter in season 4, Unsafe and Pariah. Just overall thoughts, impressions about Alicia and that pairing?
Well, I mean, obviously her character was crazy, but I don't know if it was the actors like Sarah Carter and Tom Welling or the characters they're playing had insane chemistry. Like you have to think when he was, when Clark had his Lana stuff, it was very kind of like it was like a cute, innocent thing. And it was like they always kind of held back whenever they could. But with Alicia, it just was there and it was like hot, I think it's kind of strange that he did like the very next week he's trying out for football and doesn't bring up that his wife just died, essentially. But
yeah, in season 4,
no, I
agree.
really liked that. Yeah. Yeah, but I really liked that dynamic between the two of them. I mean, it's like, oh, I finally met somebody who understands what it's like to be different like me. And, even though she wasn't an alien, I think, that meant a lot. And that's probably what you would have wanted if, like, Laurie had shown up.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
I big fan of Alicia and the Clark-Alicia pairing. And yeah, I mean, you talk about chemistry. I mean, it was really sizzling between the two of them. And yeah, for Clark, I mean, this is the first instance where he doesn't share his alien origin, but he does reveal his power. She knows he has these abilities and she has an ability herself. And there's the freedom between the two of them that he's just not experienced before. And when it all goes south in that season 3 episode, there's a great, moment with Martha there. And I would say throughout the show, some key clutch Martha Clark scenes in the love department. And one thing that Martha says in that episode, and I know in other instances as well, of like, there's someone out there for you. Like she recognizes how hard it is for Clark to try to navigate these waters, but that there is someone out there for him. But yeah, I mean, just to kind of, for Clark to be able to kind of unlock that kind of dynamic was really something. And yes, a different vibe than the Lana Clark of it all. When Alicia teleports into Clark's bedroom in the middle of the night and they start going at it, and Jonathan interrupts. I mean, it's one of those key moments, certainly in that relationship. I guess this isn't a ship that never sailed, but a ship that I wish had a far longer voyage. I wish we had more with Alicia. Honestly.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure creatively they probably wish that too. I've never heard it directly, but I think Alicia was kind of a surprise for the show. Because like I remember reading like pages from the Obsession script. I'm like, okay, this isn't that great. But then they got such a perfect actress for it. I mean, they did bring her back for a 2-parter, so that was something. But I also like, obviously she's different from Lana, Lois, Chloe, or any other love interest for Clark. And I think that's interesting too. It was a fun dynamic, even though she was crazy.
Yeah, but to your point, the fact that they did bring her back, and this was at a far less serialized portion of the show. And so the fact that she came back and it was a 2-parter when she came back in season 4 was great. And, it also, I rewatched Unsafe and Pariah from season 4. And, it also brings up a really interesting kind of ethical question for Clark and the show, because she is released from Belle Reve. She is, in theory, cured of her obsession. And, it does sort of become this question, especially between Clark and his parents, of like, well, the doctors cleared her. And then, of course, that one doctor who ends up being obsessed with her and whatnot. But it's like the doctors cleared her. Like, should she not be given a second chance? And that's another instance where you pick up with Clark, I think, at his loneliest, right? Like where he's doing homework at the Talon and he's the captain of the football team at this point, and the girls come over to him and they're like, oh, we're having a party. And he says no, because he's been down that road with Lana, right? And it never works because he can't share all of himself. And then when Alicia reappears, it's like all of a sudden this opportunity is there again, and he's willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. And you talk about key moments and musical moments. Jesse McCartney, Beautiful Soul, when they're ice skating, like it's a sweet, charming scene between the two of them, where again, the chemistry is just on full display. And then of course she has to get away from the doctor, and she, drugs him with the red kryptonite, and they get married in Vegas and all that business. And then of course in the second episode that Alicia returns for in season 4, it takes an extremely, I think, shocking and dark turn where she is killed. She is hanged by the freak of the week, Tim, who longs to return to a simpler time, and he's out to like punish the sinners of Smallville. And it's, you know, it's gut wrenching. And I was, even in rewatching, I knew what was coming. I was like, man, like that was dark, death by hanging.
And, you know, we as an audience did not know it was coming. So, like, you've kind of got me wanting to go look up the Krypton site forums for the live discussion of Pariah when it was on, just to see what people's reactions were. I'm sure they're there somewhere. Just, I think people are like, oh my gosh. It's also interesting because even though you had the fans arguing over who Clark should be with, I don't feel like Alicia was like a threat to them. You know, like no Klana people are like, ew, Alicia. I mean, maybe I just didn't see it.
I guess maybe there was this recognition that, you know, she's a guest star, right? So they could only ever go so far down that road, even if she did a few episodes, maybe.
True, but Lois was originally a guest star too.
True. But I guess the added layer here is that Alicia was an original character. It's like you bring in Lois and it's like, oh, this is Lois, as opposed to, you know, maybe there was a little bit more, a little more leeway they afforded. But yeah, I mean, and to your point, I'm not shocked when you say, you know, you read the script and it's like, okay, well, you know, we'll see. I think this is one of those instances where it probably did catch the makers of the show and the audience by surprise. And I think a lot of it really had to do with the casting of Sarah Carter. I mean, she just brought that character to life. The chemistry was amazing. And it had it been more serialized at that point in time, and had they known what magic they had with Alicia, I like to think that maybe she wouldn't have gotten so obsessed so fast in one episode. I mean, that would have been a fascinating arc. You know, it's weird because like the way it's set up, she goes crazy, so to speak, so fast in that episode. And then when she comes back, and then you kind of, you know, you have to kind of rehabilitate the character and, you know, make it believable enough that Clark would even entertain this when she returns.
Well, you know, we didn't really talk about it, but, you know, there were a couple of temporary love interests that were always brought in for like 5-episode arcs, like Adam Knight in season 3 for Lana, or Victoria for Lex in season 1. I mean, I did love Helen Bryce. I thought that was kind of, you know, paced well. I'm disappointed she never came back.
And next week, we're going to be getting into the Lex of it all, and we'll talk about Victoria, and we'll talk about Helen. So, yeah, still more to say on that front. But, okay, so speaking of Lex, I mean, you know, shifting back to Klana, you know, we're at this point now where he's kept this secret long enough and eventually breaks up with her, finally and fully, in the episode Hypnotic in season 5, when, because he realizes this is not working, he can't keep doing this to her, he can't keep hurting her. You know, there's moment once again in the loft where she's like, look me in the eye, tell me you don't love me. And he does, you know, he lies and he says, I don't love you anymore. And boy, within a couple of episodes, we have the first true Lex-Lana kiss. The Lex-Lana romantic pairing.
Yes.
Your take on it, sir.
I think it was inevitable. I do think, in a way, I mean, if you want to like psychoanalyze it, I think Lex went after Lana so he could have something that Clark does not have. So he could have something Clark wants, which is kind of cruel. I still have my own weird issues with the pregnancy storyline, because I think it's static. Where Lex finds out Lana is pregnant, he appears surprised, but he's the one that orchestrated the fake thing. So how is that possible? Also, we got an interesting dynamic for Lana. You know, she was kind of like doing this like mob wife thing for a while. And that was kind of fun to see. Also, being with Lex probably showed Lana what she had with Clark, for better or for worse. So it was good for character building. I mean, I think it's kind of creepy when you think that Lex met her when she was like 14, but we're just not supposed to think about that.
Well, yeah, that's actually a question that I had for you, because like, in fairness, there had always been this bond to some extent between Lex and Lana, going back to the Talon, right? The fact that that they go into business together and she runs it. And so they've always had that dynamic. And she confides in him when she's thinking about going to Paris. And so there clearly there's, some kind of bond, but to your point, there is this thing where you have this age gap. So that's not anything that the show, reasonably could or should have entertained until the point in the show when it did.
They're adults.
But I don't know. I go back and forth on this because I know Alan Miles have always talked about this being the triangle that they were building toward. But part of me says, well, if this was always in their minds, like, why not have the characters, whether Clark and Lana were older to begin with, or Lex was younger, even if he's not a true contemporary, but if he was a few years younger, so you could get here sooner. It's weird if they had this plan all along to kind of have this built-in delay. But then again, when it does eventually happen, it is at a point where the friendship between Lex and Clark has fallen apart. And like you said, I think the fact that Lex is going after what Clark had and what Clark wants is a big factor here. So maybe it works. I go back and forth on this. I don't know. And,
maybe, Lana wants to be with something that would hurt Clark, not intentionally. But, it's like, sometimes we do things in life where we don't really think them through. And we do it, and then we realize later why we did it. Like maybe she was so hurt by Clark, she just wanted to hurt back in her own way.
Yeah. Well, again, like I said, I think I'd forgotten how fast the Lex and Lana pairing happens after the breakup with Clark. And so, this is clearly someone on the rebound, someone hurting, and Lex swoops in, and, the two of them together, it's not quite as, it's not in quite the same category for me as Lionel and Martha, where it's just like, no, this is so wrong. But it's kind of close to that. But again, I agree with you. I mean, I think this was inevitable, I suppose. And like you said, though, the fact that the kind of like this mob wife angle, you mentioned this with Chloe earlier at the end of season 2 with Lionel, like maybe she's going down a dark path, and then they quickly pivot away from that. With Lana too, I mean, it could have been the case, like she went dark from this point forward, but they quickly pull her back. But did you just think about the different avenues that could have been explored?
Plus, that all leads to that episode where Clark and Lex are buried under the rubble together, and they actually talk about all that's been going on, and that might not have happened if not for the Lex and Lana relationship building into it. Because, yes, they talked about it, but I feel like that built the tension and the rivalry between the two characters a lot.
Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about this next week, but I think one of the aspects of the show that I love is that, in my mind at least, why the friendship fell apart, why Lex went bad. I mean, to me, I don't attribute it to one thing. I think it's a confluence of factors, and I like that the show made it that. And yes, I think this love triangle was a key piece of it, but it wasn't the only piece, right? I think that's important and good. It creates another interesting ethical dilemma, I think, for Clark, especially when we get to the episode Promise, where Lex and Lana marry. And at this point, like we had said, Lana had seen Clark using his powers, but he didn't know this, and she decides she's going to leave Lex. But then, of course, Lionel forces her to go forward with the wedding and to honor the promise that she made to Lex. But Clark, has, again, with Martha, this conversation about, like, I can't let Lana marry Lex. And Martha says, like, you have to leave her alone, right? And it's this interesting thing because Clark knows a side of Lex that Lana doesn't, or at least not to the full extent. And she seemingly is choosing to do this. So it's like, what is Clark's role here in all of it? It's interesting. Like, he protects, he saves, but this is one instance where I can't.
One might argue that Martha was Lana in another life.
Creator and podcaster Perry Constantine, host of Superhero Cinephiles, has a special offer for listeners of this podcast. Visit percivalconstantine.com/DFK or click the link in the show notes. Fill out the form and then get 2 free novels and 1 free superhero short story. The novels are Vanguard, Heroes Forged, an Avengers-inspired team of superheroes, and Ronin Born, a cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic, fascist Japan. The short story is Omega Knights, Fire and Lightning, a Power Rangers-inspired prequel to an upcoming serial. Take advantage of this offer today, and be sure to catch Superhero Cinephiles on all major podcast platforms. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join All Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit allyeahcomics.com and follow All Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw, yeah. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show, too. Finally, when we get to season 7, Lana had been presumed dead. Then it turned out she had faked all of that. She comes back to the farm. They have their reunion. And they embark on a true relationship where she knows his secret and they're living on the farm together. But as we see over the progression of season 7, there's this dark side to her now that I think has been unlocked through everything she went through with Lex. And it's a different Lana than we had seen before.
And it might ruin the rose-colored glasses that Clark was using when he would look at Lana. Like, maybe there's a little bit of disappointment, or like, wow, you know, I always thought she was perfect, but she does have flaws. And I'm not saying it's wrong for her to have flaws. I mean, any character would. But Clark would just, you know, look at her in such a rosy way that, you know, because, you know, sometimes you glorify the person that you're in love with.
Yeah, and she actually calls him out on this. One of the ones I rewatched was Wrath. That's the episode in season 7 where we have another kryptonite lightning accident and Clark's powers are transferred to her, but he retains his. So they both have powers. They're able to engage in physical activity again, and it rocks the whole town. But very quickly, there's this notion that the power is corrupting her, or, you know, kind of bringing out these dark feelings, and she goes after Lex. And this is already after she had abducted Lionel earlier in the season for his role in making her go through with the wedding and threatening to kill Clark. And at the end of that episode, after everything's been resolved, she says exactly, you know, what you just brought up, where, you know, Clark is putting it all on him, right? Like, he's blaming himself for this anger that she feels towards Lex. And she says, like, you know, you have to allow yourself to see me as I am. So, you know, interesting dynamics at play. In that episode, there's also a moment where in the big climax where she still has the powers, but she very angrily says to Clark, "You could do anything, and all you do is hide out on a farm." And we've talked about this, how during the college dropout years, you know, you really did have him shying away from what his ultimate destiny would be. In fairness to Lana, though, I mean, that's kind of an angry manifestation of it. But in the episode Action, where they filmed the movie on the farm, the Warrior Angel movie, you know, she has that moment where she says to Clark, you know, just like in the fictional realm, Warrior Angel is this inspiration. You know, you could be an inspiration to millions of people. And he's like, well, there aren't even a million people in Smallville, Lana. But I just bring it up to say that I think that the relationship did hold Clark back to an extent, but I don't think Lana did, which is an important distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, she was encouraging.
Well, I think it's also interesting when you consider the Crisis crossover, which I do consider as canon, that he does end up back in Smallville on the farm. And I think that says a lot about his future relationship with Lois, too. That even though Lois is the city girl, she loves this farm boy that she calls Smallville. And, you know, that made sense to me. Yeah, I think by season 7, Clark and Lana weren't what they wanted from each other, if that makes any sense. They had both changed. They weren't the same kids they once were. I mean, there have been so many things that happen in those first 150 or so episodes that, you know, it's like, you know, she went through this horrible relationship with Lex, but now he knows that she was capable of having a relationship with Lex, which he was also probably hurt by. Yeah.
And I mean, not for anything, but there's that episode, is it Fracture, where Clark goes into Lex's mind and Lex forces Clark to watch the memory of Lex and Lana being intimate with each other. I mean, it's a hard image to erase as a viewer, let alone for Clark, who's in love with Lana. Not that she should be punished for it, but again, it's just, a lot that they've been through. So yeah, I mean, I think season 7 shows that, this is not, this is not going to be the thing in the future. But again, to me, like I said, it's still kind of wild to think it takes until season 7 before they kind of have that kind of relationship together without the secret. But then again, by this point, she has her own. And it ends up being pretty short-lived. We don't have Kristen for the last 5 episodes of season 7. That was after the writer's strike, so they have Lana in a coma. And then she sends this goodbye breakup video that Clark watches. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we find out that she'd done that under duress. We find that out in season 8. But yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of hit on the real broad strokes and a lot of specific individual moments with Clark and Lana. But before we, kind of wrap up with where Clark ends up with Lois, I want to answer a question from one of our patrons, Brian Dempsey, who says, since we know Smallville was very formative for you, what, if anything, about Clark Kent or other DC Comics characters did you learn for the first time through the series? So I was really kind of thinking about this because for the most part, I feel like, again, there was a lot of originality to the show. And I feel like where they did draw inspiration, a lot of it came from the Christopher Reeve movie series. And especially when you had Jeff Loeb on the writing staff, I feel like there were sometimes pulls from the modern era of comics that I was familiar with. Like when Brainiac shows up in the form of Milton Fine, it's a different Milton Fine than the comics, but I'm very comfortable with the idea of Milton Fine Brainiac, right?
Right.
And even the character Claire Foster, who has a role on the show, in the comics that Jeff Loeb was writing, she was Superman's therapist. So she has a different role on Smallville, but there too, it's like, oh, okay, like a lot of it felt very familiar to me. But what I would say, and this was something that I wanted to hit on, and I think this is a perfect episode for it, the variations of kryptonite. That's what I feel kind of was one piece that was largely new to me. And again, I'm talking about the non-green variations, because in the comics that I grew up reading, there was one arc, Crisis of the Crimson Kryptonite, with Red Kryptonite.
Yes, that's when I started collecting.
Nice. So this is like very early Triangle era time period where Mixie creates this red kryptonite that Lex uses, and it strips Clark of his powers. So, it's not an emotional reaction in the character, but it strips him of his powers. And then, of course, Lois and Clark had done red kryptonite. And the one instance that most stands out to me is when it makes him very apathetic.
Yes, that was my first real, aside from the comics, introduction to red kryptonite. And I know I think they did that twice in the series. I think they used it again in another episode, but Individual Responsibility was the episode. That's one of my favorites, actually.
So I had some frame of reference, but still very limited exposure to red kryptonite. And I guess I knew from whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow that gold kryptonite was a thing in the pre-crisis comics that could strip him of his powers permanently. But again, we're talking really just like a few fleeting, meetings with other kinds of kryptonite at that point in time. So, watching this show, seeing how they used red kryptonite a good half a dozen times over the course of the show, gold kryptonite, which pops up in season 10 and most notably in the finale, black kryptonite, silver kryptonite, gemstone kryptonite, and blue kryptonite. I think that was kind of relatively new for me. But most of all, red kryptonite, right?
Yes.
Which removes or at least lowers Clark's inhibitions. And it's introduced in the season 2 episode Red. We'll see it again later that season in Rush. And then again, the end of season 2, beginning of season 3, Exodus and Exile, and the beginning of Phoenix when he's on his running around time in Metropolis. Again, Alicia will use it on him in Unsafe later in season 4. Probably my favorite outing for it is Crimson in season 6 with the engagement party. And then Upgrade in season 9 with one of the Metallo Zod episodes. And then it's not Clark, but Connor's exposed to it in Scion in season 10. Just overall feelings towards Red Kryptonite and kind of what it was able to kind of bring forth in these episodes.
Well, for starters, I believe that was introduced in the first episode Jeff Loeb wrote for the series.
Yes.
So who knows the comics better than, somebody who writes for the comics. Like I said, I feel like it was almost like a stand-in for like alcohol or drugs. And that's a relatable story, So I really like that. And it showed, the repercussions of being reckless. And that's also a very interesting comparison because I think Smallville at its best would give you these moments that, as I said, that are just like real life, but through a super lens. It is a story about growing up, but it's a story about Superman growing up. And and as you pointed out about like Crimson, for example, it really brought out some fun moments. I think Tom had a lot of fun with these episodes where he got to be a little bad. I mean, his best episode to me is still Transference, where he gets to be bad Lionel. My other favorite Tom Welling performance, obviously, was Rosetta, the scene with Christopher Reeve, just because, I mean, come on, it's an icon. And Tom really brought it in that scene. But I think the Red Kryptonite also showed us some parts of Clark's character that we wouldn't have seen otherwise, because it showed us the version of Clark that we might see if he would allow himself to just lighten up and be.
I agree with all of that. I think, from an acting standpoint, it seemed like he relished it, and it was great to see that from Tom Welling. And the Red Kryptonite episodes were always fun, but more importantly, like you said, it allowed you to get more insight into what Clark is going through, what he wants, what he's been keeping inside, because generally he is reserved to a point. Like, he'll only verbally articulate so much about what he's feeling, especially his frustrations. And so when you see all of that let out, it's fascinating and insightful. And I think what I was kind of most intrigued by as I was rewatching these Red Kryptonite episodes is you see over the course of the series, every time it happens, there are some commonalities across Red K. Clark, but what he wants, what he lets out, does shift as we make our way through the series. I mean, in Red, for example, yes, he asks Lana out on a date, and he ends up making out with that other girl, Jessie, and he wants to go party at a bar. So we kind of more like a typical teenage rebellion. But I think what stood out to me more was kind of the material wants of the character, because the whole setup for that episode is he wants to buy the class ring, and Jonathan doesn't want him to spend the money. And so when he's under the influence of Red K, he racks up this credit card bill with the big TV and video games and speakers and his new wardrobe, and he borrows Lex's car, and he's going to steal the tech or whatever it is from Jesse's dad and sell it. Like this kind of, again, the material side of things that he hasn't been able to experience, you see that is a want of the character, and that's what manifests there.
And he does that at the beginning of season 3 as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, he buys that apartment, he dresses snazzy,
Yeah. And I would say there with season 3 in particular, not only do you have that, but I think there, I guess the way I look at it is really this shirking of the responsibility, right? Like this idea that Jor-El is commanding him to embrace his destiny and all of this, and he, messes up in a major way at the end of season 2, and now it's just shirking all of that, and it's living this carefree life. So again, I think you see a little bit of a shift in that as well.
Yeah, it is a little unfortunate that. I mean, it makes for good drama, but we also see Clark being a little bit cruel at times. Like when he says to Jonathan, "You're not my father." Like, that might be something that he's insecure about, the notion that Jonathan is not his birth father. But the way it comes across, it's like his anger is amplified by this Red Kryptonite. But again, people say things they don't mean when they're drunk sometimes.
Right. But, one of the things that Martha in particular calls him out on when we get to Crimson is that it brings to the forefront something that's already there, right? To some extent, to some level.
Yes.
And the moment with Jonathan that you mentioned from Red, that stood out to me as well. And, you get such an interesting kind of flip on that in the Splinter episode in season 5 when Clark is paranoid and imagining things. But when he grabs Jonathan and he's holding him up against the wall, Jonathan doesn't actually say, but what Clark perceives is Jonathan saying, "You're not my son. You're just a thing I found in the field." Right. So it was an interesting kind of flip on what Red K. Clark says to Jonathan in that episode. And then another really important piece to this is how he comes upon the red kryptonite in the first place, right? Like with the class ring, obviously he doesn't know what that is. He puts it on. It has this effect on him. But then at the end of season 2, Clark chooses. Like he says to Lana in that scene I was talking about, I chose to let that part of me out. Like you were saying about this allegory for drugs or alcohol, it's like, he chose to put on that ring because he didn't want to feel the way he was feeling anymore. I mean, it's right. Again, it's tapping into something very fundamental here.
I mean, at that point, he was even blaming himself for what happened to Martha's baby.
Yeah.
So he really was like, and Jonathan was mad at him, and it's like, wow, everybody that I love.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, by the time we get to Unsafe in season 4, I think that version of Red Kryptonite Clark is just horny. I mean, that's just a real horned up Clark. I mean, that's his sole objective is taking his relationship with Alicia to the next level there. That's kind of his sole
focus. As if he wasn't already feeling that for her, but it made it amplified, as we said.
Yeah. I'm going to skip over Crimson for just a second. By the time we get to Upgrade in season 9, it's the biggest outlier when it comes to Red Kryptonite Clark, because that's where he inhales the dust after that explosion and there's the red kryptonite particles. And, we're deep into season 9. This is the Zod season. He's in the black outfit. He's the Blur. And it's the least pronounced difference between Clark and Red K Clark that we've seen on the series. And the want that's manifested here is a brotherly bond with Zod. And he aligns himself with Zod. And he takes him to the fortress. And after everything's wrapped up at the end, he talks to Chloe about seeing the sisterly vibe between Chloe and Lois. And that's what he was longing for with Zod. So it was interesting to kind of see that shift. Like it was I would say the least fun Red Kryptonite episode, but fascinating to see, I think, the maturity of the character. Because I don't think that was a Clark that was bottling up quite so much as he had been before. I think that might kind of account for why there wasn't as much of a distinction as we've seen before.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one thing about Smallville that has been overlooked a lot is that Clark did change over the seasons. He did evolve to a more comfortable place. And whether that's with Lois or just anything in general. Like, yes, life threw some really bad things his way, but he got through it. And I think that's the other thing about this series is Lex did not make it through.
Yeah.
Because, he had stuff thrown at him and it just put him lower and lower. And, Clark finally, came through the light.
Yeah, he became the light. But far and away, Crimson in season 6 is my all-time favorite Red Kryptonite episode where Lois inadvertently dons this red kryptonite lipstick and falls for Clark, and they kiss, and then he's infected with it, and they crash Lex and Lana's engagement party.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about standout Tom Welling moments. This is one of my favorite scenes of the whole show when he crashes that engagement party. And I think maybe this one even more than the others, you realize how much he was bottling up because he goes after Martha.
Yeah.
He's like, Dad's been dead, a year? I can't blame you to be in the race with Lana to see who's going to add the Luthor monogram to their name first. He goes to Chloe. He's like, I'm not surprised to see you here. You probably figure with Lana off the market, all those years of unrequited pining might finally pay off. And he's like, can't say I haven't thought about it. And then with Lana, he's like, I got to hand it to you. Like, if you were going to rebound with someone, might as well be the person I hate the most. But come on, Lana, joke's over by now. It's like, and then he reveals to everyone that Lana's pregnant, right? Which was something that they were keeping secret. And, of course, Lex tries to stop him. And this is the moment that I think sealed the scene for me when I think it's Lex who tries to get him to stop. And Clark turns. He's like, I am not done yet. And it was just, as much as a lot of these Red Kryptonite episodes, I think, do lean into some humor and some like outrageous moments. But like you were saying, like there's a darkness and there's an edge that comes out of Clark, and you see it there. You saw it back in Exodus in season 3 when Chloe tracks him down at his apartment, and his scar is acting up, and he needs to get her out of there, and he really grabs her and yells at her. I mean, it's a different side of the character.
Yeah, it brings out a darkness and sometimes even a cruelty.
Yeah. And then again, and then when he takes Lana to the barn and Lex tries to intervene and Clark grabs him and he's like, if I had known who you would turn out to be, I wouldn't have saved you that day on the bridge. So there are some dark truths that come bubbling up in this.
And that's such a dark thing because Clark saving Lex on the bridge was the beginning of their friendship. So by saying that, it means our friendship doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And so that really hits Lex where it would hurt.
And then when you get that wrap up scene with Martha, I feel like, she's always his mom and she's loving, but what she does kind of say to him in that scene is like, this essentially shows you've been bottling up a lot. Like, this doesn't make you say things that you've never thought. And he's like, well, so what are you saying? Like, I want to kiss Lois, but keep Chloe in my back pocket and I'm in love with Lana. And she's like, only you can answer that. But yeah, it was, again, that was definitely a standout one for me, especially in this era of the show after Jonathan's death, where we have had a more stoic Clark, to see all of this come out.
Well, we should also think about, I think Crimson was also their way of getting around the restrictions over Clark and Lois' relationship at that point in the series.
Yeah.
Because they just said, oh, he was on Red Kryptonite. And then finally around season 8 or 9, they were told, okay, you're allowed to get them together. Bryan Singer's not doing any more movies. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, on that note, for our final act of this episode here, we've hit on a number of key points about Clois, the Clark Lois pairing. But I guess let me just ask you what again, moments or milestones, developments in their relationship stand out most to you, or most kind of highlight or capture the dynamic between them?
Well, we've kind of talked about it, the end of ISIS, where, he tells her his secret and she's like, what took you so long? And then tackles him, and then all those papers fly around in the Daily Planet. I think that encapsulates this version of the relationship, that they really just want to tackle each other by this point without even needing Red Kryptonite, but also they found a connection. And it's very interesting too that Lois had a connection with the Blur, not even realizing that it was Clark she was connecting to. But that kind of says, it's kind of a duality, or like a reversal of Chloe's fever letter in a way, because, Clark is the one who's kind of invisible to her, but he's there all along. And then when she finally sees it, it just suddenly makes complete sense to her. And, I know there was like that confusion soon after she finds out, like where she thinks, she decides to leave for Africa or something. But, ultimately you could just see, and again, I'm jumping ahead, but, I talked about the crisis scene where Tom and Erica come back and they still have it. I felt like I was watching Clark and Lois from 2009, the way she was still ribbing him like, oh, Smallville, you made it funny. And I know part of that is because it was actual writers from Smallville who wrote that scene. Don Whitehead and Holly Henderson. And I do think sometimes early on they overplayed the I hate you bit. Like, I remember Crypto, like the teasing got to be like, okay, we get it. But it almost felt like, not that it became this, but it almost felt like in the early episodes that Lois was in, she was more like an annoying big sister.
Yeah.
And especially if he only saw Lana in that romantic way, that sort of thing. And I think it's so funny in Exposed when she's doing the dance and Clark is just completely bashful and embarrassed. But he's gonna look.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's the thing. Like, there's very much that chemistry and that spark. And again, whether the source of it is this antagonism initially, or again, like you said, this kind of almost sibling dynamic, or then actual attraction, there's something there from the outset. And like you were saying, because of these restrictions, we didn't have a true exploration of their romance until the final few seasons of the show when we move into the Metropolis era. And I have to say, in a way, I actually think this was a good thing because it would have just been a completely different vibe if they jumped right into a romance or a love triangle. And I think this allowed space for, again, just a different kind of dynamic. It could exist unto itself without the baggage or the weight or the pressure of the romance. Now, in fairness, I don't know, maybe that would have mixed things up in an enjoyable way if we could have had that earlier, but I don't know. I think this is one instance, the phrase constraints make the artist, like maybe there's something to why it ultimately proved so satisfying when we saw them go down that path in the final seasons, was because that hadn't been available to them or to us, until that point.
I completely agree, but also about the evolution of their relationship. I think, we were talking earlier about how like Alicia gave Clark a comfort. I think Clark gave Lois a comfort that she might not have even known she needed. But, moving around from army base to army base all her life, I think she didn't get to form true caring relationships with people, not even her own father or her sister. So to bond with Clark and, be able to razz him even, I think was really healthy for her character and ultimately led to where it did.
And the razzing is really important because I feel like generally people, those who know Clark's secret, but even those who don't, they do. There's a certain level of reverence for Clark. Like he's a good guy. He helps people. Again, even when they don't know the full extent to which he's helping them. And Lois, saw him as this dorky farm boy and really gave it to him. And I think that's good. It was, again, just like a different thing for him to experience and for them to play. And again, in seasons 4, 5, 6, 7, there are a lot of times where they're kind of on their independent roads. And of course, she had her whole romance with Ollie. Well, briefly before that with AC.
Grant Gabriel.
Grant Gabriel. Pal Michael Cassidy from the OC. But when they did interact with each other, obviously that kind of razzing dynamic that we're talking about. But another thing that kind of stood out to me is that she was there for Clark at a couple of his absolute darkest moments. When he finds Alicia's body, she's there. She's there with him and she comforts him. And when he watches that breakup video from Lana, again, she's there comforting him. There's something to that she's there in two of his darkest hours.
And she was around, after Jonathan died. Maybe not on screen, but we knew she was around somewhere.
And then there's also, again, we do have, some of these hints towards their future when she talks about, a dream about a guy in a cape. That stuff wore thin for me when we kind of have those kinds of references. But moments where you do see little like hint of something at the end of Devoted, the end of her initial 4-episode arc in season 4, when Lex made a call and got her back into college and she's going to be leaving for a while. And she's out with Clark on the football field and they're saying goodbye. And she's like, if you hurt my cousin, I'll break your legs. And she goes to hit his arm. And she does hit his arm. But just like that, that kind of dynamic, the episode before with the dunk tank, like we were saying, Exposed, like you mentioned, where, very Lois and Clark-esque, right? It was fun. They were investigating the same case from different angles. They converge when she's doing that striptease in the club. And that's when he also makes that helicopter save. And at the end of the episode and the talent, she thanks him and it's hard for her. And she acknowledges that. And she's like, but you were there for me, you showed up for me. And it's like the briefest, tiniest little hint, like as the episode is ending, but like, it's like something there.
I also love that we had episodes like Homecoming where Clark got to see his own future with her.
Yeah.
And I think that also the strength of where the relationship was by that episode, like the fact that, yes, high school is memories of Lana and all that, but he's with Lois now, and that's cool.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. And, that's a point in the show where she knows he's the Blur. She's seen him from afar after the kiss moment where she's kissed by the Blur and recognizes it's Clark. And then she sees him after his fall. But, it's not until that ISIS episode you're referencing where he shares the full secret. And again, kind of on this note of revealing the secret, we talked about how with Lana, he, did it out of desperation. With Pete, it was really out of necessity. Pete found his spaceship. Chloe,
Yeah.
also out of his hands, right? Alicia showed Chloe.
Yeah, Alicia did it.
Like she showed Chloe as Clark was,
But Clark did kind of get forced to tell her after he saved her in the Arctic.
Yeah. But again, forced to, right?
5.
Like, she's transported to the fortress. It's like, I don't know how he would have explained that away. But yeah, I mean, he does decide to tell her about Krypton, but still, it's like, it was really out of his hands. But with Lois, it was really this mature kind of, I think confident decision to do that.
Yeah.
Did you feel at the start of season 8 that the show gave us enough to account for how because there's an argument to be made, like Lois flips pretty quickly in terms of her feelings towards Clark. Like those feelings turn romantic pretty quickly in Odyssey. Do you feel like we got enough there, tracked and it worked?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, they had just lost 2 or 3 of their main characters. So you had to make do with the people you have. Yeah.
I mean, I think sometimes you see somebody in a new light. And I think her seeing Clark show up at Black Creek to help save Chloe, I think she saw him in a different light, and that continued to progress. And I like that it took Clark a little bit longer to get there. I think that made sense in terms of where Clark was. But when you get to the point in Bride when they're about to kiss, it does feel earned to me. And then really in seasons 9 and 10,
Lana ruins it.
Of course. And we talked about all of that. But then, seasons 9 and 10, it really progresses. And it talked about Lois being there for him in his darkest moments. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the beginning of season 9 and the second episode in particular, Metallo, where, again, Clark is embracing his Kryptonian side. He feels like his humanity led him down the wrong path with the whole Doomsday Davis Bloom situation, blames himself for the death of Henry James Olsen. He's abandoned his Clark Kent persona and he's just patrolling as the Blur. But it's the return of Lois that really kind of pulls him back. And when he returns to the planet at the end of Metallo, she, runs up and jumps him hugs him, and, starts telling him about what she's been doing. And it just kind of pulls him back. And at the end of season 9, he recounts that to her, how important that was at such a dark moment. He's like, I was so lost last fall and I came back. And, I think you see that effect, that she has on him. And from there, we have their first kiss in Crossfire. Again, these moments that we've been referencing, I Love You in Homecoming, revealing the secret in the following episode, Isis, the first time they consummate the relationship in the following episode, and then the proposal in Icarus midway through the final season.
And let's mention in Homecoming, he does kind of like float when they dance.
Yeah.
Luckily, she didn't notice. Or he'd have some splaining to do.
My last couple big picture questions about Lois. One is just, this is a major deviation from the mythology. Later, the Man of Steel movie would do something similar where Lois is there in the story before he becomes Superman.
Right.
But, at this point, this was a major deviation to have her inserted into his story so early and to be there for the creation of the dual identity and the bumbling glasses act. How do you feel about that?
This was the story they were telling. Like, it could have been a cheat if we didn't get, if it just stayed stagnant and didn't go anywhere. There's a part of me that does wish that he had been Superman before they at least thought about getting married. But that's just my own personal thing. It actually annoys me even more that at Lois and Clark's first attempt at a wedding, he's not wearing his glasses.
I know.
Because it had already been established.
What bothers me about the finale with respect to Lois and Clark is that they don't actually get married. That, of course, it gets interrupted with the whole gold kryptonite possessed Oliver bit. And that even 7 years later in the flash forward, they've still just never had the time. Part of me is like, all right, maybe there's something charming to this never-ending engagement. But we had gone so far, it felt like just complete the circle of having them complete their wedding ceremony.
Yeah, but having some of the score from Superman the movie and that scene where they're going up the steps at the very end kind of made it worth it. Like, you know what? They're not there yet, but they will be.
And speaking of, great musical moments, the Sarah Bareilles Breathe or Breathe Again song that's playing as they're walking down the aisle. Yeah, it's great. And, even as we get to that very end of the series, Lois is having these doubts. She feels like she's holding holding Clark back to an extent, or just this notion that she's being selfish by being in this relationship with him. Like every moment that she takes with him is time that he's not saving someone else. But of course, they ultimately realize that it's still worth it to be together. And Chloe there is a voice of reason. The scene where she says to Lois, he's not a god. He's a man. He needs to rest. He needs to have a life. So I like that. And
that's an important. Oh, sorry.
No,
that's an important lesson from the show. That he needed time to be human, and I think even Jor-El says, your time in Smallville with the Kents and the people of the town informed who you are. And I mean, that's what makes one of the things that to me makes Superman a great character is that, yes, he's an alien, but he probably has more humanity than any of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I was going to say too, with Lois and Chloe, is that when Chloe finds out the secret, she asks Lois for advice. Obviously, she doesn't say what it's about, but if you knew something that you knew someone didn't want you to know, what would you do? And Lois's advice is like, well, I wouldn't tell them. I would just go out of my way to help them and be supportive and try to make them feel comfortable enough that one day they would. And that's what Chloe does. But I think that's an important piece because, Chloe has that whole run for the second half of season 4 where she's helpful and encouraging to Clark. She doesn't tell him that she knows. She doesn't push him. But that was informed by the advice she got from Lois, which I thought was nice.
And that's eventually what Lois did.
And when Lois was in that same position herself, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So finally, like I said, we've hit on a lot. I think we focused on the most significant, substantial relationships. I'm just kind of scanning through my list here, pairings that we didn't talk about at all. Kara, Jimmy, for a quick lightning round.
I feel like that was part of the problem with season 7. Is I feel like they wrote Kara as she should just be a love interest. So it was like Jimmy, and then it was Lex, and then it was somebody else, and it's just like, just let her be her own character. So I thought that was kind of silly, unnecessary, but Smallville for some reason always had to pair up characters. Like probably the next one you're going to mention, which I think should have never happened. So you have to guess which one I'm talking about.
Lois Ollie?
Should have never happened would be Chloe and Oliver.
Chloe and Oliver. Yeah, fair.
I feel like doing that was like giving Chloe the consolation prize for not getting Clark. And I know they wanted to give Justin stuff to do and give Allison stuff to do. But I kind of feel like Chloe and Oliver didn't even like each other early on because they had such different tactics. I was always kind of bothered by that. I felt like it was fan pandering too. Because there was like a contingent online that wanted that, and I'm just like, yeah, but since you mentioned Lois and Oliver, I actually kind of liked that one because it gave us a test run for how Lois would react to being with the superhero.
Yeah, and we had that one episode with her and AC, and then of course a more involved relationship with Ollie. I mean, I remember at the time, like the comic shop, we're always joking. It's like when we eventually get to, in the future, when Clark's at a Justice League meeting, like, half the league has already dated Lois. It's like she's clearly drawn to these heroes, which, I think makes sense to an extent.
And there's a classic Lois Lane comic book cover where she's like kissing each member of the Justice League.
Yes.
And they're like in line. And yeah, so, I mean, there's precedent.
Yeah. So, while we're on the note of Ollie, so Ollie Lois, Ollie Chloe, Ollie Tess. I mean, Oliver really, he really made the rounds on this show.
Well, he was a playboy.
Yeah.
I don't remember a lot of Ollie Tess, to be honest, but I did like their dynamic. I mean, really, I think Cassidy Freeman, I mean, we don't really talk about her enough in the context of Smallville, but like she did bring a lot to the show at a time when, they just lost all those series regulars. And I think the only thing negative I could say is that it seemed like it took them until season 10 to decide what exactly to do with Tess. But once they found that thing, she's amazing. Like, she was my favorite character in season 10.
She was great. And I love just kind of having that counterpoint. This was a Luthor Clark was able to save. Right. When he couldn't with Lex. Yeah, no, I was a big fan of that character. Chloe Jimmy, I mean, could have been fun. I think Chloe Jimmy could have been fun, but he was always insecure and jealous of Clark, and even how the episode
Davis.
Pete. I mean, the episode when Pete came back for one episode and he's hugging Chloe at the end, and Jimmy's like he was just always, there was an insecurity there that I don't think poor Henry James could ever, kind of fully overcome. And then yes, we get into the Davis business, which is its own thing, but frustrating is the word that I would kind of characterize the Chloe Davis Jimmy saga.
Well, here's a question: how could Jimmy afford to buy a watchtower for Chloe when he was like selling drugs for money like just the week before?
Yeah.
But no, beyond that, one thing that came up, because I think Chloe had told Clark that she hooked up with some guy in an internship or something early on in the show. And I remember when the casting sides and the spoilers came out for Thirst, the one with Carrie Fisher, she had an assistant named Biddleman or something like that. And everybody thought that was going to be the guy that Chloe had hooked up with. So, later, of course, we found out it was Jimmy. And I think that kind of made it a little bit fun. I almost think it might have informed those characters better if we had seen a flashback to when they first met.
Yeah, that could have been cool. That could have been cool to see.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we've been going for 2.5 hours, and I know, look, when it comes to the relationships of Smallville, the ships, we could be here forever, but I'm really happy with the conversation we had, and I think we've really focused on, certainly, from my perspective, I think the most significant, substantial relationships, and especially looking at it from the perspective of Clark. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say that it's a different feeling talking about them now versus when the show was on the air, because there were so many feelings flying around, dealing with the fan factions and how much they would fight. Like, I remember, May 14th, 2011, I was just so relieved. It's like, oh, don't have to deal with the fans fighting anymore. And then Arrow happened. But, yeah, it just, I really do think this fueled the show. And I do like that even if people don't agree on who they wanted Clark with or whatever, that everybody had a favorite. And that's something that makes Smallville special, is that you could be a Chloe fan, be a Lois fan, be a Alicia fan, Lana fan. But the fact is, you did have a favorite. And I think that speaks to the show as a whole.
Well said. Again, I mean, this was such a major component of the show for me personally. And I think really does help account for why the show was as successful as it was, why it ran for as long as it did, and why it was able to attract not just people who were Superman fans or comic book fans or whatnot, but just a much broader audience, because it tapped into something that, everybody can relate to in some way, shape, or form, just as it did with Clark trying to figure out where he's from, where he's going, all of those moments as well. But certainly when it comes to the matters of the heart, it was a major part of the show. So it was worthy of this epic discussion. And I thank you so much. And where would you like to direct folks?
You can find me at kryptonsite.com. It still exists. ksite.tv.com. I'm going to be on Talkville in a couple weeks. Hoping to be at the Smallville convention in October. I don't know if this will run before then or not, but you're nodding yes, so I assume it will. And yeah, I'm going to be doing an episode of Starkville's House of L soon, and I believe Zach is dropping. We discussed the season 10 premiere of Smallville, which should be a fun discussion. And spoiler, I liked it a lot.
That's a great episode.
But yeah, if you go on Amazon, I wrote the season 4 through 7 companion guides for the show. I still wish I could do 8, 9, and 10, but who knows what the future may bring.
Right on. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Thank you, audience. I always appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back next week as the trials of Smallville continue. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. And this podcast is made possible by the support of our Patreon community. Sign up for a monthly or annual membership at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato and choose from a range of rewards. This week, I want to spotlight our President Luther's Cabinet tier. Get every episode of the podcast at least a day early and commercial-free. Sign up today, and thank you to all patrons. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.